morning, everybody. Morning. I got the magic button, but I gotta have the other thing going on here too, or I won't know what I'm going to talk about. Yeah, so I'm from the Vermont Folklife Center. The Folklife Center was founded in 1984. We're a statewide cultural heritage research and education organization. Our offices are in Middlebury. And I guess to sort of nutshell our perspective on things, you know, we focus on the present of Vermont with reference to the past and an eye toward the future. You know, who we are, how that relates to who we were, and then who we want to be. And our work is really grounded in ethnographic interviewing. I'm a folklorist, which means I'm not an anthropologist, as my wife, who is an anthropologist, reminds me. And I'm going to just talk a little bit about this culture concept from a vaguely folkloristic, and anthropological perspective. I was asked to open this with an acknowledgement of the first agriculturalists from this place we now call Vermont, the Abenaki people. And following the lead of my colleague Christopher Kaufman-Ilstrup of the Vermont Humanities Council, I've chosen to read an Indigenous land acknowledgement that he shared at the Vermont Reads event at the Flynn Theater with Andrew Iden and Representative Lewis on the book of the last year's Vermont Reads book, March. It is important that we acknowledge that the land we are on is the traditional and unceded territory of the Abenaki people, who have had a continual and enduring presence here since time immemorial. That presence continues to this day. The indigenous people of Vermont knew this land as Wabanakik, and they are the Wabanaki people. In Abenaki, Waban is the white flickering light in the sky, and Aki means land or earth. So the Abenaki are the people of the Dawnland. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about this idea of culture and the cultural experiences of agriculture here in Vermont. By all rights, this talk should be given by my late colleague, Greg Sharrow, for whom agriculture in Vermont and the culture of agriculture were passions. So I'm kind of walking in his footsteps, because pretty much everything I know I learned from him. I gotta find the doodad. What is culture? I'm not going to give you a definition of culture so much as a perspective on it. One simple thing I like to say is that it's the implicit list we carry around in our heads of what's appropriate and inappropriate. This is oversimplifying, but it's a place to start. You know, and one way into this, and this is sort of an old-fashioned way to think about it, but it's to start with this idea of binaries. What is food and what is trash? What is male? What is female? What's a child? What's an adult? What makes a house? You know, these are all things that we learn and that we share in varying degrees among the people we live in closest proximity to. They vary between human groups. They've changed over time. They are not fixed and are arrived at, and this is sort of my wonky definition, the collective conspiracy, consensus, and ongoing negotiation that is culture. Another way to think about it is the system by and through which we make the world comprehensible. Culture and cultural categories help us sort out the overwhelming sensorium we encounter on a daily basis and shape it in ways that allow it to make sense to us. We're a social species, and within our social groupings, both small and large, we develop and redevelop shared ways of making sense of the world. The same experiences, the same sounds, the same smells, can mean very different things across different human groups. Culture provides a framework for making sense of those worlds. So the question is, like, why does this matter? And my argument is always, if we want to understand how someone else makes sense of the world, how another person lives, what matters to them, we need to try to understand what informs those things, what informs how the world works for them. And getting a sense of that can help you kind of figure out, to see the world from someone else's perspective. I got a couple of anecdotes I'll share. You know, living in Vermont, I had never used Lyft. until I went to a conference in Baltimore a couple weeks ago. And I couldn't even summon the lift. The executive director summoned the lift for me, and we the lift showed up, got in the car, started driving, and the guy driving sort of looks at me kind of through the mirror, turns around and says, "Can I ask your opinion about something?" And I'm game for that stuff, so I said, "Yeah, sure." And he started talking about his problem with his girlfriend. If you knew me, that is not the right question to ask me, but I talked to the guy a little more, and it turned out that he's an immigrant from Ghana, and he was talking about how she wants to take time off, but does that really mean she wants to break up, or does that really mean she wants to take time off? Kind of often a time of memorial question in relationships, I guess, for some people. And I said, "So let me ask you a question. Is she from Ghana too, or is she from here?" He said, "Oh, she's from here." So we talked a little bit more, and I said, "Have you thought that maybe this is a cultural thing, right? That maybe she has a set way of understanding what relationships mean, a language for that's informed by all sorts of stuff, and you've got this other one." And he's like, "Didn't think about that. That might be true." Thumbs up for Andy. Excuse me. And then I was like, this is my point, and kind of my point fundamentally is that, okay, so if you can understand what's informing her, you can understand maybe better why you're missing each other. I don't know how it ended up, and it was definitely not what I expected from the gig economy, but it was fun, actually, and the ride took a long time, and I couldn't tell if he was going a different way. So I'm going to put up another quote right here, which is a little more complicated here. I'll read it out because I don't know if y'all can see it over there. Believing with Max Weber that man is an animal suspended in webs of significance he himself has spun, I take culture to be those webs, and the analysis of it to be therefore not an experimental science in search of a law, but an interpretive one in search of meaning. I'm a kind of big fantasy and horror nerd, and the idea of being suspended in webs, that alone attracts me here to this quote. But I'm also, the thing I like about this quote is that suspended in webs of our own meaning. This is the reality we create. And for Geertz, as the symbolic anthropologist he was, his job is to figure out what this is, to look at this stuff and try to make sense of it. There'll be a test. I keep forgetting about to do that. I'm just going to throw this one up here too. So this is, there are a lot of ways people have tried to represent the culture concept sort of visually. This is one that I was introduced to early on, and so it's the one I go back to. And if you can read it, it's the Iceberg Model of culture. The top stuff is the public stuff, right? It's those things we do. Included up there, what we eat, how we speak, performances, festivals, all these kind of public expressions of who we feel we are. And then as you slip under the water, you get into those quiet things. In this case, notions of courtesy. That's a big one, because they vary pretty dramatically, right? Attitudes towards ethics, approaches to religion, all this stuff that informs kind of who we are on a much deeper level that we don't normally notice, right? So part of what I'm going to subject you to, I'll leave this up for a second, for the remainder of the morning, is kind of just an overview of a bunch of different, what I'd say kind of facets of culture. Everybody ready? So I say culture is often invisible. Culture is learned. We're not born this way, right? It's shared, but not monolithic, right? And it's dynamic. It changes. Now, there are whole bits of other ways you can slice this stuff up. These are just 4 ways of slicing it up I've sort of decided to look at for the sake of not driving you crazy with having to listen to me talk for a very long time. So when we say this, when I say culture is often invisible, I mean that for most of us on a daily basis, it's automatic. We don't think about it. You know, we don't move into a social situation necessarily, a familiar one, and say, this is what I need to do here. We just do it. You know, we don't go into the bathroom and think, what's the appropriate way to use this roll of paper hanging next to me? We kind of just know, right? And so I'd say it's internalized in that way. You know, and this metaphor may not work for you, but it's like we're in a picture and we only notice the frame sometimes. And then when you do, you kind of get the sense that you're working through a system. The other thing, how I think about this is culture, we notice it most often through contrast. Most often when we bump into something that breaks with our expectations, right? That's not happening the way we think it should be happening. What the hell is going on? You know, one example I like to tell about this one, I went to graduate school in Indiana, and when I was there, I started dating a woman who grew up in St. Genevieve, Missouri, which is a small farming town on the Mississippi south of St. Louis.